Namaskar and good evening. This is Divyanshi Shrivastava welcoming you to an interactive session brought to you by Kavyavarsa. Kavyavarsa is an ISO registered community to engage dialogues on crucial issues with concerned authorities and global change makers, alongside engage in government led projects, research work, fundraising event, and student conclaves on policy decisions. It is founded by some of the national representatives of National Youth Parliament Festival who were felicitated by Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, Government of India. Kavivarsha has been titled as Grandmaster by Asia Book of Records, has national records registered in India Book of Records for hosting maximum eminent personalities in a virtual platform. It is being officially appreciated by Government of India and appreciated by Lead of STEM Innovation Lab, NASA. The media partner for today's session is Inside Northeast. Today, we are joined by Sri Tenzing Lekshe, the official spokesperson of Tibetan Government in Exile, to discuss on the topic Tibet's cultural genocide and Indo-Tibet relation in New Age diplomacy. Welcome, sir, to Kavivarsha.
Thank you so much, Divansha, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about the cultural genocide and India-Tibet friendship. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to have you, sir. And starting with the very first question. China issued 15th white paper, which talks about the complete victory over poverty and protection and development of traditional culture. They also say remarkable progress in ethnic and religious work and embracing new journey of an era. Let's try and understand. What is the need for them to come out again and again? Does it reflect their insecurity about their hold on Tibet? Or are they kind of bringing political stability in Tibet?
Divanshi, first thing is this year they have produced or published the white paper on Tibet to commemorate the 70th year of the so-called peaceful liberation of Tibet. Now, you have to understand, as you mentioned, there are 15 white paper on Tibet, and they will do so in the future also. So we believe that. That is what there is a big question why they continuously produce white paper on Tibet for the foreign audience, for the international audience to let them tell that whatever happens in Tibet for the last 70 years was prosperous, happy, developed, So, but in fact, if you look at 70 years of the so-called peaceful liberation, we said it very clear by saying that this wasn't a peaceful liberation. That was a forceful, brutal occupation of Tibet. And just recently, Chinese president visited Tibet's capital, Lhasa, and Nyingti. And he was there in Lhasa to celebrate the 70th year of Chinese occupation of Tibet. But by saying that whatever the Chinese Communist Party had done in Tibet, whatever policy they had done in Tibet, it was perfect. But in reality, it was not perfect. The reality shows that in 1950s, when they first invaded Tibet, till 1970s, in the late 70s, more than 1 million Tibetans died because of the Chinese occupation. More than around 6,000 monasteries destroyed. So that was the reality. And there we had the genocide of Tibet. People were killed because China wanted to occupy Tibet. And then after China's economy was liberalized in 1980s, 90s, 2000, China understood that whatever they had done in Tibet was wrong, completely wrong, because it didn't, right, take the heart of the Tibetan people. The heart still remains. The Tibetan heart was not being associated to Chinese because of the bloodshed. So what they try to do is they try to change their policy by introducing economic leverages, transformation, like infrastructural development, by building Tibet infrastructurally. So even then, Tibet became just like a Chinese cities. Right now in Tibet, there is a cultural genocide going on. There was a demographic shift taking place in Tibet. More and more Chinese are coming into Tibet, settle over there. Tibetans are becoming minorities inside Tibet. The cultures are being assimilated. The people are being economically marginalized. And the rich resources in Tibet were being used and exploited. And the ecologies were being destroyed. So therefore, whatever China did in Tibet, they did it for themselves, not in favor of the Tibetans. So if they want to settle the problem, we have the existing problem right now, the Sino-Tibetan conflict for the last 70 years. If they want to settle it, they have to settle it peacefully. And there is only one way, that is to accommodate, to understand, to fulfill the aspirations of the Tibetan people inside Tibet. In doing so, they have to resume the dialogue with the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese leaders. They cannot skip by telling the world that whatever they had done in Tibet is good. Fact of the matter is, whatever they had done so far in Tibet was wrong, completely wrong. They haven't even thought about the wishes of the Tibetan people. They only serve their own purpose, political purpose, to occupy, to colonize Tibet. So it's not a time for jubilant for the Chinese leaders. Still, there is a conflict, so they need to resolve the conflict peacefully.
So as you rightly mentioned about Chinese President Xi Jinping visiting Tibet, that's an important point to discuss. But before that, I want to understand China issuing these white papers. How does it affect the Tibet's prospect in restoring religious, cultural freedom, and also political independence?
In the white paper, they have mentioned what they have done, to preserve the Tibetan culture, tradition, and all these things. The white paper is all about good things, what they have done, what they think they have done, But in fact, we can say that this is not a white paper, this is a black paper, They haven't served any purpose to fulfill the aspirations of the Tibetan people inside Tibet. For example, I will tell you the language policy. Inside Tibet, Tibetans, obviously demographically, they have become minority. Now, even though the constitution gave some kind of leverage for the Tibetan language to sustain, but even then, they used to have a bilingual policy, language policy. But when you look at Tibet, since there are majority Chinese over there, the name of the street names were being designated as a Chinese name. The towns, place names, everything has been changed to the Chinese names. And the tourism, even if you look at tourism, the numbers are picking up. So for what reason? The only reason is to assimilate the Tibetan culture, And that too, at this moment, when Xi Jinping visited Tibet, in Lhasa, he said that 70 years, right, Tibet has been prosperous, right, because of the work of the cadre, because of the efforts of the Chinese cadres, the communist cadres, and all the ethnic groups in Tibet. Not even mentioning Tibetan people who owns the Tibet, who was the legitimate owner of Tibet. He didn't even mention Tibetan people. So what happened is, for whenever Chinese they publish white paper, it has its own reason of fear that there is an international momentum going on Tibet, right, in solidarity with the Tibetan cause. Right. Therefore, the fear is not good. When there is a fear, they will only talk about stability. So for the last 70 years, there is only one word which is in the mind of the Chinese people, Chinese government, the communist regime, that is the stability. Right? If they really want stable, they have to fulfill the aspirations of people. And then, over the recent past, but they claim that Tibetan Buddhism is a Chinese characterizations. Everything has to be a Chinese characterizations. So, if you look at the Tibetan Buddhism, since from 7th century, we got it from India, from Nalanda, the tradition which was from India. In fact, the Tibetan Buddhism is an Indian originations, but China have been pushing hard to make the Tibetan Buddhism as a Chinese characterizations. So therefore, they are not, I think, doing services for the Tibetan Buddhism. Right? And in the monasteries, there were management committees which were monitoring the syllabus, curriculums of the monasteries. They made restrictions for the novice monks to recruit in the monasteries. So everything has been controlled. There is a strict surveillance going on in Tibet. When there are strict state surveillance going on in Tibet, how can you be peaceful? How can you be harmonious? Right? How can you be prosperous? So therefore, there is a big reason for China to understand that Tibet still has a problem.
So definitely, as you mentioned, the political stability could be only ensured when aspirations of people are ensured. So we have been discussing about the Chinese President Xi Jinping visiting Tibet. It was first time in last 30 years when a Chinese president was visiting Tibet. What possible agenda you can see behind his visit to Tibet? Because while his visit, he has been reviewing a lot of infrastructure development, recruiting Tibetan people in Chinese army. So, what is the possible agenda you could see?
See, Xi Jinping, since he became president, now recently he visited eastern part of Tibet in Qinghai, they so-called Qinghai, we call it Amdo, right? And then after a month, he came to Lhasa, the capital city, right? And before that, he visited Nyingti. So we see the possibility. We see there is an opportunity for the Chinese leader to understand the real aspirations of Tibetan people. Xi Jinping got the real opportunity to understand the aspirations of people. Because staying in Beijing and listening to the hardliners, right, cannot serve the purpose of China. So personally visiting the Tibetan places, try to understand the gravity of the issue. That can change the narrative of the Chinese leaders. So therefore, what I felt is Xi Jinping got the real opportunity. Now it is up to him to see whether he can act according to fulfill the Tibetan aspirations, or to maintain the strict surveillance state in Tibet, which they are doing right now, right? To continue to to impress upon, right, discriminating the Tibetan culture, tradition, and everything. So therefore, this time when he visited Tibet, he visited Lhasa and then in Amdo and all these places. I believe he will also visit the eastern part of Tibet, which is other area. So if he can visit all the three traditional provinces and then see the gravity of what is happening, we hope that he can play a huge role and make a legacy for China in the future to be a peaceful country. Otherwise, right now, whatever policies, whatever international diplomacy, whatever they play, they've been called to deceive. Right? There is a deception behind the Chinese policy in the international forum. So Tibet is a litmus test for China. If they do good in Tibet, it'll be good for China. If they do bad in Tibet, it'll be bad for China's image. So the ball is in the hand of Chinese leader now, whether they want to be a good or whether they want to be a bad.
So, having discussed about the current scenario and political developments, I want to take you to the past. After Dalai Lama arrived in India in 1959, he discredited the 17-point agreement, claiming it was thrusted upon Tibetan government and by people by threat of arms, and CTA is only the legitimate representative of Tibet. So the dismissal of 17-point agreement itself disowns the legal control of Communist Party of China. So does the international law has any clause to invalidate an agreement signed under such circumstances? And if they have, has CTA approached international courts and created international alliances on the same?
In 1950s, let's say soon after the Communist Party became a regime in China in 1949, they propagate that Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia will be under China. And since then, they have rigorously tried to occupy these areas. In 1950, when the Tibetan government was, when the China came from the eastern part and occupied the eastern part, the Tibetan delegation was sent to negotiate with the Chinese leaders. And during that time in 1951, May 23rd, the Tibetan delegation were forced to sign the agreement. If they haven't signed the agreement, then China said that they are going to brutally occupy Tibet. Therefore, in favor of the Tibetan people, they were forced to sign. When they signed, there were 17 agreements which they have to fulfill. So in between, His Holiness also maintained, the government of Tibet at that time sent delegation to India also, to try to impress upon the international community, to look upon the Tibetan status. But somehow it didn't work well. And then the Tibetan government, in order to understand, in order to get along with China, with the 17-point agreement, they try to reform, try to negotiate with China over numerous years. And even in fact, in 1954, His Holiness visited Beijing and spoke to the Chinese leaders, tried to understand what was the reality, because at that time Tibet force was not powerful, and then China brutally occupied Tibet. There were many Chinese PLA armies stationed in Tibet, so it was compelled. But the Tibetan government tried to negotiate on the terms of the 17-point agreement. But China rejects all the terms. That led to the escape of His Holiness the Dalai Lama into India in 1959. It was not that the Tibetan government didn't try to live in terms, but it was the Chinese government who rejected all the terms, even though they forced upon the Tibetan government to agree upon the 17 points. But they were the one who didn't appreciate. They didn't go along with the terms. So that led to His Holiness to come to exile, and almost around 80,000 Tibetans came in 1959. But if you look at, soon after His Holiness came to India, His Holiness rejected the 17-point agreement. Right? To tell the world that whatever they had done, they didn't abide by the rules, they didn't abide by the terms of the 17th point. It was made with the forces, right? It was signed under duress. So we have no obligations now. But even then, there were resolutions passed in the UN General Assembly on Tibet in 1959, 61, 60, 65. Even then, there were resolutions in the UN, but the Tibetan situation was not being resolved. We are still living in exile. We are still living, we are longing to go back in Tibet. Still, 70 years is gone. Right? Therefore, I would say that now the exile administration under the leadership of His Holiness since 1979, we pursued for the middle way policy to resume dialogue, to talk to China in terms of seeking aspirations for Tibetan people. So in 2011, His Holiness devolved his political leadership, and we have an elected political leader. This year, Mr. Pemba Tsering is the elected political leader. He's been elected and he takes the political responsibility. Right from the first day, he said that the China need to talk and resume the dialogue so that the Sino-Tibetan conflict resolves. Thank you.
So as you mentioned that dialogue is definitely very important, as you are advocating a midway approach with China. Last year in November, first time President of CTA, Lobsang Sangye, was invited in the White House for a diplomatic dialogue. Is CTA trying to engage in diplomatic ties with other nations and trying to get international recognition?
Ivanshi, we have 13 different offices all over the world, and we have international supports from different parts of the world. In fact, now Tibetans are living in more than around 20 different countries in the world. So there are momentums, there are solidarities. In fact, even in India also, right? You can say that more than around 99% of India, right, supports Tibet. They support emotionally since 1959. The solidarity movement in India is very strong, and that too in the international forum also we have many resolutions being passed in the parliaments, different parliaments, right? And recently the US government has also enacted the US policy on Tibet, that is the US policy on Tibet Policy and Support Act in 2020. So therefore there is a momentum going on in solidarity of Tibet. Why? Because the Tibetan struggle is for truth and justice, right? So therefore, everybody, right? Even in India also, right? The truth prevails at the end, and even for the Tibetan also. Even though we have the 70 years is gone, we still are hopeful that the truth will prevail at the end. Thank you.
So as you have talked about the different international organizations supporting the cause for Tibet, and different at 13 headquarters we have Tibet communities. Recently, a Tibetan community of Switzerland have submitted a 5-point appeal to United Nations, which included a call to end China's cultural genocide in Tibet. its interference in Tibetan religious belief and tradition, among others. They also met the representative of UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and submitted a four-page appeal letter and address to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, do you think UN has played its role and has a potential to play a critical role in solving the issue, especially when
Especially when
China stands at the Security Council as permanent member with a veto?
We have to be hopeful all the time. If there is no hope, there is no struggle. No matter whether China is the member of the Security Council of the UN, as of now, right, China is the power just below United States. Right, it's the second power. So therefore, China has to be responsible citizen of the world. They cannot keep on saying that we do not want anybody to talk about Tibet issue. Tibet issue is not a domestic issue of China. This is the international issue. Because of China's occupation of Tibet, there are so many problems happening in the world. As I said before, Tibet is a litmus test for China. If they resolve Tibet issue, China's prominence, benign state will be right there in the world. Right? So therefore, it is up to China, it is up to everybody, right, who seeks the truth and justice. So therefore, for UN, as I said before, we already had 3 resolutions passed in the General Assembly in early 60s and late 50s. But after that, there wasn't any resolutions because China was there. But China cannot keep on rejecting Tibet issue in the UN table. But they have to be responsible. If they are not responsible, they cannot become a power which has been entrusted by the people of China and the world. So far, China seems like a pessimistic, but they have no other options. They have to be benign. They have to be They have to be truthful, and they have to be responsible. So therefore, I think the UN can take a much greater role in pushing, in pressurizing, in telling China that whatever they had done in Tibet was wrong. By looking at the resolutions which they have adopted in 50s. So therefore, we still remain hopeful with the UN.
We hope the same, and also we are hopeful China needs to be a little more responsible. So Dalai Lama confirmed a Tibetan boy in 1995 as reincarnation of Pancham Lama, the second ranking leader. The Chinese government took away the boy and his parents and installed its own child, a Chinese government. The Dalai Lama's choice are whereabouts still unknown. So we would like to know more insights on this issue of cultural genocide and silence of the world community on it.
In 19, as you mentioned, in 1995, His Holiness recognized the reincarnation of Pancham Lama. And right after a week, he was disappeared, his parents were disappeared, the selection committee member were also being imprisoned. Since then, nobody knows about the whereabouts of the Pancham Lama, which was recognized by His Holiness. Even now, nobody knows. There were lots of petitions. There were lots of queries about his whereabouts. But China still shut their mouth by not disclosing whether he is alive or where he is, what he is doing. So far, if you look back, Even the UN cannot, cannot see, cannot find a boy. He was a political prisoner of conscience. But what can a 5-year-old child can do to create a problem for China? But China always prescribed a threat, even at 5-year-old boy. So therefore, for what reason why China did? Because they want to earn the legitimacy of the Tibetan Buddhism. As I said before, Chinese characterizations, Buddhism of Chinese characterizations, they have this order number 5, which says that the Chinese Communist Party is the legitimate authority to recognize the reincarnated lamas. Nobody else has. They have the database of Tibetan lamas in Tibet. So therefore, they try to control and monitor and take away the legitimacy of the Tibetan Buddhism. So Panchen Lama, what they did is they tried to appoint another Panchen Lama by using a golden urn, which they said that was the Chinese tradition, which was implemented to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But in fact, it was not the tradition. It was not the prominent tradition. So therefore, for having recognized Panchen Lama, their own Panchen Lama, it's a kind of an exercise for the future when they try to reincarnate their own Dalai Lama. So there is a fear that China is going to reincarnate, authorize their own Dalai Lama. But let me be very clear, nobody will believe China. Right now, the Chinese Panchen Lama, whenever he stays in China, if he is a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, he should be in Tibet. He stays in Beijing and occasionally goes to Tibet whenever the Chinese government needs him to go. And he tried to tell the Tibetan people that whatever the Chinese government did was right. So he became a spokesperson of the Chinese communist regime. Therefore, inside Tibet, not many Tibetans revered him. Nobody. In fact, when he visited Tibet, even if you look at the street in the Tibetan areas, you will not find his photo. If he's prominent, everybody will keep the photos. Because he's not prominent in Tibet, nobody revered him in Tibet. That's why the market is not there. There is no demand for his photo. In spite of that, you will see the previous Panchen Lama's photo. Because people revered him, the previous. But nobody can keep the photo of the boy who was recognized by His Holiness. If they were possessed or if they were caught with the photo of the boy who was being recognized by His Holiness, then they will put up in jail and imprisoned. There's a threat in their own life. Just as having a photo of the Dalai Lama. There were many people who were being imprisoned, cautioned, interrogated. They were put in jail because just by simply having a photo of the Dalai Lama. So therefore, China, whatever they did, as I said before, they need to really look beyond the infrastructure. Beyond the infrastructure. The infrastructure is what the Tibetans don't need. The Tibetan people need, to believe in their freedom to exercise their religion, culture, and to also to preserve their ecology, which is not there. So therefore, it is high time again, I impress upon, it's high time for the Chinese leader to have a wisdom to understand the reality of the problem. Thank you.
So, in the same cue, I want to understand that Chinese definitely needs to understand the real issue, apart from infrastructure, as you said. Um, but in the same cue, I want to understand about China stated that all the reincarnation of tulkus of Tibetan Buddhism must get government approval, otherwise they are illegal or invalid. The Communist government of China has also declared the ownership on selection process of next Dalai Lama. Sir, how serious threat does it possess on Tibetan culture and most importantly on Tibetan independence movement? How far is Tibetan Policy in Support Act passed by the US Congress reaffirming the right of Tibetans to choose a successor to the Dalai Lama? Will it be helpful against the Communist Party stance?
We have the existing tradition of choosing the reincarnation. Tradition was theirs for the last more than 700 years. It was not the Chinese culture. And for an authority who just finished all 100 years, right, cannot take the legitimacy of the tradition which exists for 700 years. So this is the perfect example of how China tried to control the Tibetan Buddhism for the sake of their political objective. They are not in favor of preserving the Tibetan culture or traditions. It is only for the sole purpose of the existence of the party, their own selfish objective. So therefore, whatever they are doing, whatever they are preparing, as you mentioned, right, the order number 5 by Sarah, right, whatever they are doing, whatever policy they implemented, whatever they talked about. In fact, Xi Jinping, when he visited Depsang Monastery just recently, he said that the Tibetan lamas and Tibetan monks, they should adopt this Buddhism, right, in aligned with the socialist ideology and all these things. But in reality, just recently they sent a circular to all the Tibetan cadres, the communist cadres who are working in Lhasa, saying that you cannot circumambulate, you cannot possess the photo of statue of Lord Buddha and all these idols, right? You cannot listen to the teachings of the Tibetan lamas. They said something, they are doing something else, right? Even to the cadres also, they are pressurizing them not to believe in the traditions, right? But in openly, they said that they have to preserve Tibetan culture according to the Chinese socialist, right, ideology. So it's a hypocrites, right? Therefore, whatever they are doing, I still say that whether they recognize the incarnation of His Holiness Dalai Lama, nobody will believe the Chinese leaders. So therefore, they need to look beyond their own selfish interests by letting the Tibetan do their job in recognizing His Holiness Dalai Lama in the future. And as a matter of fact, again, the Chinese communist regime just happened to cross 100 years. The institution of Dalai Lama begins from 14th century, right? So therefore, we have the 14th Dalai Lama right now, right? It is not the first Dalai Lama. Every time the Tibetan engage themselves traditionally in recognizing the Dalai Lama. So in 2011, His Holiness made it very clear that nobody can indulge themselves in the reincarnation process because of the political need. Right. So therefore, it's very clear for China that they have no authority, they cannot indulge in the traditional process for their own political need. Thank you.
It's very important and it's high time for China to understand that they need to start thinking apart from their selfish motive. Start thinking about Tibetan people and put an end to the cultural genocide that's happening in Tibet. So, some special message to the audience who have joined you, who are looking at you and listening to the issues that have been prevailing.
Over the recent past, China has been quite aggressive in their propaganda. So we are living in the social media world. We are living in the virtual world these days. And if you look at Tibet, many people get confused. Where is Tibet? So therefore, even among the think tanks, even among those static communities, but therefore, let me be very clear again. Tibet is not only the Tibet autonomous region. It composed of a bigger Tibet that is consisting of 3 provinces, traditional province. Right now, the China integrated the other parts into Qinghai, Gansu, Yunnan, and Sichuan. So therefore, Tibet is not just a tower. That is the very clear thing. Because otherwise, China will always say that Tibet autonomous region is the Tibet, not the other part, right? And another thing is, since I believe that most of the listeners are Indian, so therefore, for the young Indian audience, Tibet, we as a Tibetan, we're grateful to the Indian government and public for their solidarity and support. We've been in this land for 60 years, more than 60 years. And thank you all. But let me remind, we do not need the sympathy. But we do not need the Tibetan people. For the last 60 years, we received enough sympathy from Indian people. What we need is the perception, the change in the perception. But China occupied Tibet and it has its own consequences on India. So for the young Indians, they need to understand that this is the national interest. So the collaboration is needed. But you need to look beyond and think about what is really happening inside Tibet and build up the scholarship so that you will see the truth. Right? So therefore, I remind again, right, we have ample of sympathy. So we need more actions, but we need more solidarities. We need more scholarship on Tibetan studies among the young Indian. So that we can collaborate, we can join together and find a solution for this Sino-Tibetan conflict. Thank you.
These are great words of wisdom, as you said, that Tibet need not to be looked as territory, but with a vision. And also, it's time for action. Sir, since you have joined in this amazing dialogue and we got to know a lot about different issues and Tibet's cultural genocide and New Age diplomacy, any message for the team of Kavivarsha?
Kavivarsha, I have been thankful to Kavivarsha for inviting me for this session, and I hope that this platform will generate more scholarships specifically on what is really happening inside Tibet. So more discussions are needed among the Indians, right? More scholarships are needed. So through Kavivarsha, it can facilitate such meetings on a regular basis on specific issues in relation to Tibet. So I wish you all the best, and you all are doing well. I have seen some of the programs which you have, since I was invited, I looked at some of the things which you have been doing. You all are doing great. You are young India, and India belongs to the young India, right? So therefore, I hope that most of the young Indians, right, they will look beyond, right, their own and see what is great. And right now, as India has a vision, right, and has a dream, make in India, right, and then make a big India, right? There is an impression on that. So how can you make it big? How can you make a rising India? Through this, through mind, not by guns, right? And as His Holiness says that India is the only land where all the religious tradition coexist peacefully, harmoniously. You have a rich culture in this land. So therefore, I hope you will utilize the old traditions, old culture in your hand and be prosperous and be a leading country, right, to tell the world that the message of ahimsa is the only one, right? So through ahimsa, the world can live peacefully, right? So this is my ultimate message, and I hope Govt Visha can do the justice in promoting love, harmony, and truth and friendship. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Those were great words of encouragement, and the entire team of Kapivarsha will keep your words in mind of promoting more and more dialogue, talking about the issues of Tibet. And yes, we will promote harmony, brotherhood, as we have been doing now. Thank you so much, sir, for joining in this live session. It was an absolute pleasure to have you today. Thank you. Namaskar.
So much. Thank you so much, Ivanshi, and thank you all the organizers of Govt Asia for inviting me. Bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.